We've understood by now how inheritance works in CSS. Let's now talk about CSS selectors. Selectors are the way in which we specify what element exactly should be governed by a style or a rule. The simplest kind of style, like one that you see on screen now, explicitly specifies what element the style should apply to. Here, we are saying that we want this style to apply to all h3 elements. And h3 is the selector. The selector is merely one portion of a style. In addition to the selector, there is also the property. What property or properties, plural, are governed by this particular style. And lastly, there is the value, which is what value should that particular property take. In this instance, the property is set to font style, and the value is set to italic. In other words, we have a selector h3, a property font style, and a value italic. Together, the selector plus the property plus the value define the style. There are also some additional little bits of syntax that you should be mindful of. A colon is used to separate the property from the value, and a semicolon is used to indicate that the style assignment has terminated. Remember the role of both the colon and the semicolon. Now the problem with specifying the selector as we just did is that the number of styles will proliferate. As an example, let's say you wanted different HTML elements to all have the same color. This color would be in addition to whatever other different styles they already have. One way of doing this is to just use the HTML tag selectors of the kind that we just saw. This is a fairly easy way of specifying that we would like all of a certain type of elements to share a particular color. Let's see how this would play out using a simple example. As usual, we have a simple snippet of HTML. Within this HTML, we have an h4 tag, and we also have a block quote tag. We have a style governing the h4 tag which specifies that the property font size should have the value 22 pixels. This is reflected in the HTML at the bottom. We also have a paragraph, and this paragraph is governed by the p tag. We have no style set for the paragraph. Lastly, we have a block quote element. This block quote element is also governed by a style. Now, given this setup, what if we wanted a way to make the fonts for any element green? How would we go about doing this? Well, one way to do this would be to go in and add the assignment color :green to each one of the styles that we already have. We would then have to manually go in and modify every one of the styles that we have already created and physically type out color :green semicolon a bunch of times. But this again is a solution which requires copy pasting code, and anytime you do that, you know that something isn't right. Doing this for a whole bunch of different styles in this manner is just not modular. It's not pluggable. You can't specify this particular style or this assignment ought to work for a bunch of different styles. And the way in which we do this in a modular and pluggable fashion is using the class attribute. The class attribute is one of the most important parts of the interplay between HTML and CSS, so let's be sure that we really understand what's going on here. We specify the class attribute along with the name of a class on any HTML element that we want to refer to or that we want to class together. We then go ahead and create a style where we use this class attribute in the selector. Again, we create a class attribute on any HTML element that we would like to annotate in a particular way. This is important. The class attribute can work with any element. And then we go ahead and use this in the CSS to select an element to style. The way in which we do this is by including the class name along with the HTML tag name in the CSS style. Here, the selector now consists of both the HTML tag name, that is h4, and the class name, which is green-color. Just adding a class name to the CSS selector will basically cause all HTML tags of the h4 type with this particular class name to be governed by the style and to get font color equals green. In our HTML, we have two h4 tags. We have only specified the class name attribute on one of them. We have not specified the class name attribute on the other of them. As a result of this, when the browser renders our HTML, it's only going to apply this style to the first of these two h4 elements. And that's why you can see on screen, there's one h4 header which is in green as we wanted it to via the style, but the second is not in green. Again, that's because the first h4 header did have a class name, the second one was lacking a class name. We had a style which was predicated on the class name. Now, let's say we wanted to also make the block quote element be governed by this green color. How would we do that? Well, it's really simple. We just add a class name attribute equal to green color to the block quote element. And we would then create a style where we use the block quote tag as well as the class name in the style selector. Now, this is conceptually not very complicated, but it's still quite cumbersome. And that's because we now still need a variety of different styles. For instance, we have one style for h4 elements which have class name equal to green color. Then we have another virtually identical style for block quote elements with class name equal to green color. Once again, we have lost modularity. What we really want is a way to create a style such that any element with a particular class name is governed by that style. And it turns out once again that there is a way to do precisely this. In the selector, completely leave out the HTML tag. Okay, completely leave out the HTML tag from the selector and only have the name of the class following a dot. This time the selector of the CSS style is going to begin with a dot. This is important, and after the dot will appear the name of the class. In other words, all HTML elements which could have any tag, all HTML elements which could have any tag which have this class name of green color are going to be governed by the style. And this now is a real effort saver because we can now create a whole bunch of class selectors. Let's call them green color, background, and large. These class selectors will govern whatever properties we'd like. And crucially, we can now apply all of these classes to the same element. So for instance, in our block quote element, we specify all of these in the same class attribute. This is a crucial point. We have included a whole bunch of different attributes, class names, separated by spaces within the class attribute for this element. So far, we have spoken about selectors based on the HTML tag and selectors based on the class name attribute. There is one last way to specify a selector element, and that is using the unique identifier of any HTML element, that's the ID attribute. We have already seen how it's possible to link to a specific part of a web page using the ID attribute and specifying the ID attribute followed by a hash in the href part of an A tag. We do pretty much the same thing here in the selector. Only one element in a particular HTML page can have a specific ID, and therefore we create a style for that particular ID. In the selector, we start with a hash. Doing so indicates that this is referring to a particular attribute ID, and that then causes that style to apply to only that one specific HTML element. Now, since it's pretty obvious that we can apply multiple styles to the same element, a logical question would be, what happens if there are conflicting styles which apply to the same element? Well, let's talk about this later. There are some rules to determine what happens here. We will get to these later.